The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to APS Webinars. The title of today's webinar is Launching Your Postdoc Position. I'm Crystal Bailey, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. APS Webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. Before we get started today, I do want to take a moment to make a quick announcement about a webinar coming up on Monday, October 8th at 8 a.m. Eastern and 5:30 p.m. Indian Sri Lanka time, Applying to Graduate School in the U.S., Strategies for Success. Professor Unil Pereira and Director of Graduate Services Amber Amari of Georgia State University will guide students through the entire process from selecting schools to picking references. So any non-U.S. citizens in the audience who are interested in applying to schools in the U.S. will definitely want to check that webinar out. For more information, you can go to the APS webinar page and click on the link for the webinar. Today's presentation features Professor Edmund Bertschinger and Professor Steve Rolston. Ed and Steve will be giving advice on applying for postdoctoral research positions in academic and laboratory settings. After Professor Bertschinger finishes the presentation, the remainder of the program will belong to you for our question and answer session. Because of the number of people attending this webinar, we are only accepting text questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the questions panel located on the right side of your screen. You may submit questions through the questions panel at any time during the webinar, and we will answer all of your questions at the end. We will do our best to cover all the questions you submit, but we do apologize if we're unable to cover everything. Finally, a link to the recording of today's presentation will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available on the APS website on this webinar's main page. Please allow 24 hours for video upload. We also encourage you to complete the survey upon exiting so that APS Webinars can improve its ability to provide you with these valuable services. And so with that, let's get started. Moderating the discussion today will be Professor Steve Rolston. Professor Rolston received his BS in 1980 from Wesleyan University and his PhD in 1986 from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Steve is currently a professor of physics at the University of Maryland. Steve is also co-director of the Joint Quantum Institute, or JQI, a joint program between the University of Maryland and NIST designed to provide an interdisciplinary center for the study of complex quantum systems and the development of future industrial opportunities based on quantum phenomena. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Crystal. Today we have Professor Edmund Bertschinger joining us to talk about launching your postdoc position. Professor Bertschinger received his BS in physics from Caltech in 1979 and his PhD in astrophysical sciences from Princeton University in 1984. Following postdoctoral positions at the University of Virginia and at University of California, Berkeley, he joined the MIT faculty in 1986. From 2002 until 2007, he served as astrophysics division head before becoming physics department head. So Ed, why don't you go ahead and start your presentation?
Thank you very much, Steve, and welcome to everyone in the audience. Thank you for joining us for this APS webinar on launching your postdoc. I really enjoy talking with students and supervising them, mentoring them, and helping them to launch their careers. So having the opportunity to give all of you some pointers and to engage with you in the questions you may have about starting a postdoc is a real treat for me. Thank you for coming. My presentation is going to run through some of the steps that you will undertake as you begin to contemplate the postdoc application process, starting as early as a couple of years before you complete your PhD. It's important in your graduate studies to think ahead as to what your options may be after graduation and to prepare appropriately. As we all know, academic careers are about scientific research and publication. And so therefore, starting to build a publication list well before you complete your PhD is an important part of the preparation for a postdoctoral application. When you do so, if you have the opportunity, it's a good idea to work with more than one senior scientist at your institution or at others so that people who may write letters of recommendation for you in the future can become familiar with your work and become your advocates. But there are some other things that you may not have thought about so much as you're doing your graduate studies, other areas in which preparation can help you for the postdoc. One of them is in the writing of grant or fellowship applications. Since when you apply for a postdoc, often it's a similar process to writing a small proposal for funding. Indeed, that's what you're doing. You're seeking funding for your career continuation in academia. Some of the things that you can do early in your graduate career, at the beginning, within a year or so after graduate study, is to apply, if you're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, for the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And there are other portable fellowships that may be available in your subfield or at your institution. When doing so, it's a good idea to connect with other students, to get examples of successful proposals, and then very importantly, to ask for the assistance of your research supervisor or others so that you can get feedback on drafts and learn to improve your fellowship and grant writing skills. Another important part of the research career is presentation of your work to other scientists and to potential employers. So while a graduate student, it's important that you find opportunities to present your work at conferences or workshops, perhaps traveling with your supervisor, being introduced to scientific leaders in your field, and taking the opportunity to meet with potential employers even well before you'll be seeking their employment. As you approach the PhD completion, you want to now begin systematically assembling a list of potential postdocs, and I would recommend alternative career paths in case the postdoc option doesn't work out. When I was a graduate student, there were relatively few postdoc positions available. They were grant funded. I applied for some, but I also took the opportunity to apply for industrial positions in case a postdoc didn't become available to me. Fortunately for me, or maybe not, I received a postdoc and continued in one career path, but I was prepared to pursue another had that been necessary. Many of you will be at universities which have career offices which can help with providing you advice about seeking employment outside of the academic sector in industrial positions. And indeed, I should add that a number of companies will in fact have available postdocs for you as well. So it's possible to mix the industrial and the postdoc setting. I mentioned before the importance of meeting and speaking with potential employers. Sometimes graduate students will do this in a systematic tour held perhaps just over a year before they begin applications. So for example, if you will be graduating in June, and if it's now October, then now, or even in the preceding month, September, would be a good time to visit a series of institutions that you might be applying to for your postdoc in November, December, or January, a few months from now. And indeed, you should feel free to ask your research advisor, sometimes even the institutions to which you're visiting, whether they will help to support the cost of your travel. You should begin assembling your curriculum vitae or CV, that's your academic record, your publications list, and your research statement, and I'll say more about those in the subsequent slides. And then finally, to help you assemble the list of potential postdocs and to keep track of the comings and goings of your peers and people who maybe are a year or two ahead of you, you can find the relevant rumor mill pages on the web, blogs, and so forth in your subfield of physics to get a sense of how much application traffic there is, what issues people are facing, and so on. Now, there are several types of postdocs, and you'll have to make some decisions about these when you assemble your list and make your application. There are some prestigious prize fellowships which require a nomination rather than a direct application. Among these are the Berkeley Miller Fellowships, the MIT Pappalardo Fellowship, Harvard Society of Fellows. There are a number of other prize fellowships that you can apply for, but they have a detailed process, an extended set of procedures that are special to that funding agency or program. For example, in astrophysics, NASA offers a series of prize fellowships called Hubble, Einstein, and Sagan. Many universities as well, including the Princeton Center for Theoretical Sciences, offer sets of prize fellowships, and sometimes you can submit one fellowship application and have it reviewed for a number of positions, possible positions at that institution. Look for those, but bear in mind that they're highly competitive, and so you should have some alternative choices as well. I mentioned that some universities have a series of fellowships or positions that are bundled together. The major physics departments tend to do so. You can do a one-stop shopping and submit your application to Caltech or Princeton or other institutions and have them reviewed for a number of possible positions. Those are convenient to add to your lists. National labs have positions, and some of them are associated with portable funding, for example, from the National Research Council. So again, those are very nice fellowships to have and positions because of the flexibility where you can hold those positions. And then finally, many positions are available with individual faculty PIs or principal investigators through their grant funding from various federal or sometimes private sources of support. And those are called postdoctoral research associate positions, and those can give you a great opportunity to work closely with a faculty member in your subfield. All of these postdocs are good. Find the right match. Now, as you begin to assemble your list of postdocs, you'll tabulate the deadlines. In fact, you may want to keep a spreadsheet that you can share with your letter writers, giving, very importantly, the deadlines, the email addresses or websites to which they will upload their letters. Generally now that's all done electronically. And some information, maybe a link pointing to the ads where you find these or a website describing the positions. You will want to respect very carefully the application deadlines. Never be late with an application for a postdoc or for anything else. For the prize fellowships, beware that some of them have very early nomination deadlines, even the very beginning of September. For grant-funded positions, they can be advertised at any time. You'll find them online in various places, Physics Today, American Institute of Physics, Academic Jobs Online, and also, of course, in the pages of Physics Today magazine and others. They tend to arise in the largest numbers in the late fall and early winter, but there are grant-funded positions advertised in the late winter and spring, and even occasionally throughout the summer. So watch for them. How many positions should you apply for? Well, among my students, 20 is a common number. In my opinion, if you apply to more than 50, that's too many. You should be selective. Oftentimes, you can tell that a position will be a poor fit to your qualifications. You should be working in the same subfield or have some relevant experience. When in doubt, discuss these matters with your supervisor and your letter writers, and perhaps they will feel that applying for more than 50 positions is all right, and then feel free to do so. But you should take their advice. Now, I talked about the elements of a postdoc application, including the curriculum vitae, the publication list, and the research statement. For the curriculum vitae, there's a very nice resource available online from Harvard with the link provided in this slide. The basic elements of a CV include, of course, your name and contact information. That's your postal address, a telephone number, email, the preferred forms of communication. Your education, your degrees, where and when you receive them, perhaps your doctoral supervisor, the title of your thesis, and so on. There will be a section on your experience and positions that you have held, including research assistant positions, any teaching experience that you've had, and any service work that you've done. All of those are relevant for postdoc positions, even though you might think the focus is on research. I really enjoy finding a postdoc application where the applicant describes their passion for teaching and service and describes how they wove those interests together with their research. That can give you a leg up in a competition. Of course, you should list any honors that you've received or grants that you may have received. If you have applied for telescope time or time on other precious facilities or national resources, list those. And then finally, you can list relevant skills such as computer languages, software packages, and so on. You'll find examples of CVs at the website listed above. The research statement is a concise summary of your previous research and the proposed future research. I prefer brevity. Remember that for many of these postdocs, there will be 100 or more applications. For the prize fellowships, there will be several hundred applications. Reviewers don't want to read a 10-page research statement that goes into enormous detail. If you can't make your case in 3 or 4 pages, then you're probably going to lose the reader who has to review hundreds of these. So respect the limits on the research statement that are given in the application guidelines. If they're unstated, my advice is to keep the research statement to 4 pages maximum, including, by the way, the references. That question always comes up. Don't make the research statements too small to read. Use 11-point font or larger with 1-inch margins or larger in a nice readable text. And of course, you will put together everything in a PDF document which you can email or upload into the application website. The publication list, that's rather obvious, so I've not listed that as a separate page, but it is worth noting that in a publication list, you can, first of all, you should list the authors in the order that they're presented in the author list of the paper. But then many people like to boldface their name so that at a glance the reviewer can see where you are in the author list. And you may want to put a note if there is a particular practice about order of authorship in your field. For example, it's a very different matter if the primary author is the first listed or the last listed. For some journals, of course, the articles themselves will describe the contributions made by the individual authors. You can feel free to do that in your publication list as well, putting in a sentence or two following each entry. Now, getting back to the letters of recommendation, they're a very important part of a postdoc application. Typically, there are 3, sometimes 4, but don't overdo it. If the website and ad request 3 letters of recommendation, submit 3. Typically, these will come from your PhD supervisor, from another faculty member, often at the same university or in the same research collaboration if your collaboration is distributed and you work more with people outside the university but in the collaboration. And then it's a very good idea indeed to get someone at another institution. And I recommend a faculty or a senior researcher, someone with an appointment level above postdoc. It's true that postdocs know well about the requirements of a postdoc, and a postdoc may know your work better than a senior researcher, but the senior researcher will have a little more weight, most likely, with the employer, and you can always ask your senior researcher or faculty member who's maybe not as familiar with your work as a postdoc if they would mind consulting with the postdoc you work with. You should contact potential referees at least 2 months before the earliest deadline and give them drafts of your CV and research statement. This will not only allow you to get their feedback, but it will help you to inform them about your accomplishments and in that way to help them write the strongest letters they can for you. Keep them informed about the progress of notifications, about any offers that you receive, or about disappointments that you may have as the process proceeds, and be sure to thank them for their efforts. Many, but not all, postdoc applications will involve a stage of interviews. Sometimes these are in person. Now, increasingly, they're done by phone or Skype. And even when the postdoc does not require an interview, it's a good idea to prepare for one in case you meet an employer at a conference. There are several kinds of presentations you should be prepared to give. One is the elevator speech. That's meant to be a 2-minute, non-technical summary of your work that you can give during a long elevator ride. You want a 10-minute summary of your research that you might present at a blackboard or very concisely in a short talk, for example, at an APS conference. And then you want a longer, say a 45-minute talk, which would be appropriate for a seminar. Remember that your presentations make a big impact on the audience. It may be the main information that an employer will have to decide whether to go to the next step of reading your papers and looking more seriously into your application. You want to make a good impression. So show interest and enthusiasm. Take care that you explain technical words and know your audience. That's very important. What should you look for in a postdoc? Let's say that you have major applications. You're starting to get some results back, maybe some offers, and you want to think now, what am I really looking for in this position, and how will I choose among various offers? First, perhaps most importantly, is the fit to the research group if you are going to work with the research group as opposed to being an independent postdoc. Even in the case of an independent postdoc, I would think you should want to think about the research environment and the group that you might interact with and learn from. Although the postdoc is a professional position and you're formally concluded with your university education, it's still a learning opportunity, and you want to surround yourself with people that you can learn from. The degree of independence that you want is somewhat of a personal choice. Some people want to have more independence to pursue their own ideas, some less. Some want to join in an existing experiment or to help set up a new one. Think what you value the most and then ask potential employers what the situation is like in their positions. If possible, you want to learn about the culture of the department. You want to learn if postdocs are treated as equal partners in the research lab. You may want to think about work-life balance issues. How do you balance, for example, the desires to have a life on the evening and weekends, or perhaps think about starting a family, with the demands of the academic workplace? Salary is, of course, something to think about, although in physics the salaries are usually comfortable. A starting salary of at least $50,000 in the U.S. is typical in physics and related fields, although in the life sciences areas, sometimes in biochemistry or biophysics, the salaries are less because so much of the funding is coming from NIH-supported grants with lower salaries. I'm afraid that's something that's difficult for you to change, and so if the salary level is important, then you should know that and give that priority. Oftentimes, postdocs receive, when asked, when offered, research funds for travel, computing, and so on. And of course, in some areas of science, it's very important. Travel will be an important part of your work if you're a high-energy physicist needing to go to CERN, or an astronomer going to telescopes. You want to have adequate computing resources. You may want funding to buy a laptop to support your work and perhaps some software. So look at the practices in your discipline, and if there is no explicit mention of research funds in the postdoc description or application, certainly when you receive an offer, that's something to ask about. Benefits are important too. Whether or not you are formally an employee, people in their 20s should be thinking about the same kinds of things that older people and faculty members do, about having adequate medical, dental coverage and so on, insurance, moving expenses, which are often, though not always, provided when you're moving to a position, though not from. Once you move from a position, the new employer should pay your moving expenses. The moving expenses are not always provided. Typically they are with prize fellowships, but it's worth asking. And then finally, if you have a child or are considering having children, definitely look into the child care options and see whether the institution offers child care subsidies or slots to postdocs. Finally, and this is related to the matter of department culture, having good mentoring by senior scientists with some annual review and feedback, and having career development opportunities to present your work, to strengthen your grant writing skills, perhaps to teach, those are really very important. And you should ask about them. And don't just ask the faculty, ask the other group members. There are some other issues which are important but don't always apply depending on your circumstances. If you're an international student, then the visa process can be very important. After an offer is made, you should contact the employer and the HR department therein to request the appropriate visa status. Many of the universities and other employers will provide assistance with visas, but it will depend on your exact circumstances as to what visa category they offer. And this is not an area in which the scientists will typically have much expertise, so you need to go to the HR experts. Housing is very important. Many of the top universities and research institutes are in expensive areas. The Boston area, the San Francisco Bay Area, New York, Washington, D.C., or internationally in some of the major cities, Paris, Tokyo, London, and so on, are very expensive. And the housing markets can also be very tight, as it is now in Boston. So you want to find out whether your employer has assistance in finding housing, adequate housing. This issue of taxes depends a little bit on your employment status. In the United States, there's a distinction between postdocs who are employees receiving a salary, those are typically called postdoctoral associates, and postdoctoral fellows, whose stipend is not considered as a salary. In the latter category, postdoc fellows, they make estimated quarterly tax payments to the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. That's another complication that the postdoctoral associates don't have, and you want to make sure that you receive information about how that is done. Increasingly, physicists come in pairs. They pair often with other physicists, and so options for two physicists, dual career couples, are important. Flexibility helps, as does applying to a metropolitan area with a number of institutions and with choices beyond academia as well. And then, very importantly, when you receive an offer, use it to help negotiate the best position you can with respect to those issues that are important to you. Some that come up occasionally will be the duration of your postdoc, the amount of research support, and even the salary level. It is okay to negotiate these issues. Your employer may say, I have no flexibility, but you can use the set of offers you have often to find a way of crafting the most attractive position for you. Finally, the issues and these matters I've described are in the context of a postdoc within the U.S. Some of these issues are very similar for other countries, but others, such as the taxation issues and benefits, are very specific to the country. And so you'll need to contact people there to find out what are the practices and what you should expect. Finally, some tips, useful tips. You'll want to send your letter writers reminders. It's okay to do this several times, maybe logarithmically spaced in time. 2 weeks before the deadline, 1 week, 3 days, 1 day. Well, that's maybe a bit much, but you get the idea. Don't let things fall behind the cracks, between the cracks. Remember how important it is for you to respect deadlines. You want to make sure you give your referees encouragement and early warning so that they too will respect the deadlines. When you give a talk, treat every talk like a job talk. Rehearse it well. You may be in a casual setting, but unbeknownst to you, a scientist who could be your future employer may be listening to you. And so think carefully about how you present yourself and how you want to describe your work and your future plans. Of course, you want to talk with recently hired postdocs. I hope that when you apply to graduate school, you talked with graduate students at the institution you joined. You want to do the same with postdocs and get good advice from the postdocs about the whole process. And then finally, this can be stressful. A lot of time goes and thought and energy goes into preparing these applications. Try not to let it sap all your energy. After all, you still need to finish your thesis. I want to end with some resources that are available on the web from the National Postdoc Association, Science Magazine through its Science Careers section, and Physics Today. And I hope that some of you will add to this listing. I'm sure the APS has its own listing of resources. I know the American Institute of Physics does, and so do the blogs. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to pass back to Steve, and we'll be happy to take your questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ed, for that informative talk. So it looks like now it's about time for Q&A. So we have a great deal of good questions. So let me start with one that didn't actually come up in your talk. Is it a good idea to continue and do a postdoc with my PhD advisor?
That's a variation of the question that we often hear in the universities. Can't I go to graduate school, or why can't I go to graduate school in the same department? Well, sometimes you can. I advise students to look elsewhere unless they have a unique opportunity in their existing research group. And I'll acknowledge there are times when they might. They may be working, they may have made a major contribution to an experiment, and the experiment still needs to be performed, the results analyzed. Then it's sensible. But there are advantages in going outside, even to another group collaborating in the same experiment. First of all, you expand your network so that you'll have more letter writers in the future. Secondly, you learn new things from different mentors. That's very important. In the long run, your capabilities are going to be set to some extent by the people that you have interacted with, by the whole assembly of people you've learned from. So broadening that talent pool for your own professional development makes sense.
I guess I would just add that when I look at postdocs, if you stay with your PhD advisor for 6 months or even a year, that's fine. Quite often there's a personal reason why you need a little more time, maybe a significant other. But I tend to agree with Ed that you don't want to limit yourself so much. Okay, so let's...
Steve, if I can interrupt, I'll also mention that if you keep working with your thesis supervisor, then you miss an opportunity to distinguish your research from your thesis supervisor. And there's an argument to be made that if you can set up your own shop, so to speak, then it's really clear what your contributions are. If you are continuing to work on ideas that your thesis advisor has proposed, then it's less clear how much you are able to initiate those projects and ideas. The thesis advisor can explain that, but it's just one less thing to explain if you have set up your own independent research program.
Okay, let's move on to another question. Here's a question that says, it seems to me that most postdocs get a job for a position that's not posted. I'm not sure if that's true, but I certainly know many who do. What's a good time for pursuing these types of positions?
Oh gosh, I don't know of many such positions. Certainly the postdoc associates, salaried employee positions, I think typically have to be advertised. There may be some fellowships where the support is obtained from internal funds at places that are not so well advertised. I think the best thing to do to anticipate such is to contact potential research advisors even before they have made ads and ask them whether they anticipate having postdoc positions available in their group in the next year. That can be done anytime. It can be done now. It can be done 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it never hurts to contact people. Worst case, they're going to say, sorry, I don't have any positions opening up in the near future. All right, so here's a question that says from someone from India who said they've applied to many places but still don't have any offers. Are there any tips to improve my CV or cover letter so that I at least get a call for an interview? I know this is particularly challenging when you're applying to places from abroad.
Right. But I think that the reasonable answer would apply regardless of where you're applying from. You should have your materials, your CV and research statement, reviewed by a trusted mentor, maybe an expert in the field, and someone who can advocate for you. If it's hard to find such people with your location and area of research, then ask a postdoc who's gone through the process to review them and see if they can offer some suggestions. And finally, ask your advisor, your letter writers, if they can provide extra help in reaching out to colleagues, maybe going above and beyond just writing letters, but actually more actively intervening for you to see whether their colleagues at other institutions can come up with the funding for positions, or perhaps whether they can collectively come up with funding. I've heard of cases where a student didn't get a postdoc for a while, but then a research supervisor at one institution contributed some money, as did one at a nearby institution, and they shared the postdoc for a year or two, giving the postdoc time to go through the application cycle once more.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it is challenging when you are applying from abroad. Here's a question. What's a good way to initiate a visit or be invited to give talks? How do you reach out and get someone to say, sure, come and give a talk?
Be bold. Send an email or call the scientist. It's perfectly fine to do that. I receive emails several times a month this time of year from graduate students who are going to be on the postdoc market and would like to know if they can come visit and present their work. This is very common in my field of astrophysics. I don't know if it's so common across physics, but I am pretty sure that most of the faculty will be respectful of a student's interest and try to set aside time, meet with a student, brainstorm ideas for positions with them. And if they're not, maybe they're not the ideal employer.
I guess my advice, too, for almost all these things is whenever possible, rely on your PhD advisor to give you connections. And this can be challenging if you're switching fields, but if you're staying broadly in the subfield, your advisor has a large network of people. Ask them to set you up with some connections, and that goes a long way. I know if I get a call from someone who I know well and he says, I have this great student, I'm much more likely to be interested than if it's someone completely from the outside.
Absolutely right. Thanks, Steve.
And so that leads into another question, which is, should I change directions after graduate school?
I guess that depends on how big the change is and how bold you are. I think this is really a question of style that may be different for one person and another. Some people are comfortable in continuing the same line of research, albeit with different direct supervisor and perhaps colleagues. Others are ready for a change. And it is okay to change. Now, bear in mind that you are supposed to be presenting both your past research and your future plans when you apply for a postdoc. And I would be straightforward about this. If you want to make a change, then propose it and explain why. If you've done really well in one research area and think that there's a great opportunity for you scientifically in another, make the case. Now, that doesn't always fit in well with a grant-funded postdoc where people are looking for specific expertise and experience aligned with that, with the interests. But the fellowships give a lot of flexibility, and I know a number of postdocs who have changed their research directions as a result of the freedom given by the fellowship.
I would just add that in the long term, having that broadened experience can be quite useful as you go forward, whether you stay in academics or you want to go in some different direction. Let's see, how about another question here? I'm considering postdoc positions in areas not directly related to physics. What factors should I consider in switching fields? This is related, but now we're talking outside of physics, and in particular, how will that influence an academic career?
Right. Well, of course, you always want to bring your expertise. Think about the postdoc application as you're really putting yourself in a competitive marketplace. And you want to convince the employer that you have the skills, the talent, the capacity to succeed in the type of position that they're looking for. That can be in a different field. After all, the physics training prepares one very well for careers in a number of different disciplines, including things as seemingly far from physics as medicine or geology or mathematical modeling and finance. I don't know whether there are postdocs in finance, but perhaps the salary is high enough in the permanent positions that you don't need to go the postdoc route there. So I wouldn't treat a change of fields as being dramatically different. It just means that you have a different network, and therefore you may want to choose letter writers accordingly.
Okay, this is more a comment. Well, we have a number of questions about postdoc salaries because you said 50K or more, and we've had a number of respondees saying that seems too high. Someone here saying they have a postdoc in the University of Ohio and the salary is 36. Someone else saying 38 to mid-40s. So I think the variation is quite large.
Yeah, I just want to mention that for those salaries in the 30s, they tend to be in chemistry or material science or life sciences where they're set by the National Institutes of Health postdoc salary scale, which is around that or a little bit higher, but probably below 40K at this time. So it is subfield dependent, and that's a factor to consider. But on the other hand, the intellectual opportunities may be so great that it's worth bearing that extra expense associated with the lower salary in a given field. But particularly for people who have a dual career issue or are considering families, you want to think very carefully about whether a low salary, well, let's say how important the salary is to you.
And I should point out as well, typically postdocs in national labs will actually be quite a bit higher than 50K. So, I know, for instance, National Research Council fellowships at NIST, for instance, I think are in the mid-60s now. So we have quite the range from the NIH set thing in the 30s.
That's right. Also, the NASA fellowships are above 60K.
Yeah. And I guess the advice I tend to give students is, don't let salary be the first selection. But if you have two good opportunities and there's a substantial difference, then certainly take it into account. But as you said, if it's a fantastic intellectual opportunity, having a salary of 40K is, still a lot better than you were probably getting in graduate school. All right, so let's move on. Here is an interesting question. How receptive are postdoc positions to the possibility of taking maternity leave?
Oh, wonderful and important question, and it's something that I'm very attentive to and concerned about, since the question arises through the Committee on the Status of Women in Physics and the Committee on the Status of Women in Astronomy, and in other settings. Universities are grappling with this question. Most universities, at least, do not have policies providing maternity leave beyond the requirements of the Family Medical Leave Act. And officially, those policies apply to employees and not necessarily to postdoc fellows. Having said that, most supervisors will be supportive of family leave, at least informally, and will, of course, understand that a postdoc needs time to prepare for the arrival of the family, or if it's a woman bearing a child, then there's quite a physical impact on a mother for period of at least weeks and often several months. The National Science Foundation and other funding agencies recognize the impact on women in the sciences and are looking for ways to ameliorate that by, for example, giving grant extensions to postdoc fellows and to postdoc awards for NSF grant holders. So you have to look at the institution's practices and the conditions of the fellowship that you hold, but I would definitely raise this question if you have a family or are thinking of having children while postdoc. And I would really love to see institutions make greater progress in this, since the U.S. is behind, frankly, much of the rest of the developed world in terms of the support that it gives to families.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think things are getting better, but they still have a long way to go. Okay, so here's an interesting question. If one has a long-term goal of joining industry, do you recommend doing a postdoc or going directly into industry?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I would tend to look at it as, would the postdoc advance your preparation for the industrial position? And don't assume not. It may very well. For example, a postdoc may allow you to gain some expertise in certain kind of instrumentation or data analysis, or you may get some project management or leadership experience as a postdoc that will directly translate into industry. I think academics tend to underestimate the importance of professional skills useful in industry, not realizing how important they are in academia. They're in fact essential for long-term success. The same personal skills that enable you to thrive in industry will also help you thrive in academia.
Okay, and a related question which I'll comment on is taking a postdoc a gamble? Are you committing to a certain kind of career? And it comes back to this industry question. I sometimes tell my students who are not sure whether they want industry or academics that a postdoc can be the best form of procrastination. By that, I mean that if you're not sure you want an industry job, as you said, you can take a postdoc and broaden your research experience to make you more marketable. But it can be difficult to go into industry and come back into academics. If you're out of academics for a few years, depending on what the industry is, you may have committed yourself. And so a postdoc I see as a good way to take a little bit longer to make that decision.
That's right, and I think that a lot of postdocs are using the positions in that way, hoping to get the faculty position and often taking several postdocs before they either receive a faculty position or decide that it's not worth continuing waiting. It's a gamble, and certainly it's a gamble, but all of us in academia took that gamble. I almost didn't get a postdoc. At the last minute, I got a postdoc offer, and so I stopped pursuing jobs in industry. I was perfectly happy with the idea of going into an industry as an alternative to the academic route. You may not be, but we have to work with the situations posed to us, and sometimes the job market is very tight, and going into a nice industrial position is by no means the worst thing that can happen.
Can I interject? Sorry, don't mean to interrupt, but I did want to add something because I do a lot of work based on this kind of question of preparation for industrial careers. And I will say one thing, though, with regards to postdocs that has been shared with me by multiple industrial employers. If you think you're interested in finally pursuing an industrial job, it actually does not look good for people to see a long string of postdoc positions on your CV, because it will give the employers the impression that you're settling for an industrial job and that you've, as Steve said, been in a holding pattern. So I would say that while doing one postdoc won't hurt your odds with an industrial job, I don't think that it's a particular help, and several of them is not a good thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Crystal. That perspective is really valuable. Not having made it to industry, I didn't have the direct experience.
That is actually true for academics as well. Back when probably Ed and I were both looking for postdocs, in academics, you typically went to graduate school, had a postdoc, got a faculty job. Now it's not at all uncommon, especially in theory, to have 2 postdocs, but the third postdoc generally I would recommend against. That's usually a sign that you're not moving on. So in general, I would recommend certainly no more than 2 postdocs.
That's a fine rule of thumb. Just to calibrate things, I think one has to be clear about the duration of a postdoc. Steve, I think we're probably talking about a typical 3-year duration.
Yeah,
postdoc.
2 to 3 years, yeah, would be what I would think.
Right. In some fields, there may be 1-year opportunities or perhaps even longer ones. Some of the prize fellowships can have 4 years if universities supplement them, as they sometimes do. So being out of the PhD for 6 or 7 years, your chances of getting the faculty position you seek beyond that time are really declining. And so by that time, you do want to start thinking about alternatives.
Okay, here's a question. Which recommendation letter is usually given the most weight, the advisors or another professor who's familiar with my work?
I would say the one who can write most knowledgeably about your contributions to the work and their impact. That's usually the advisor, but sometimes it may be someone else. And an applicant can ask their supervisor and their other choices of possible letter writers for advice. It's perfectly fair to ask a senior colleague, would you be able to write a good letter for me? Do you think you're a good letter writer for me? Or would you propose that I ask X instead?
Okay, so there are a couple of questions that are sort of related, which is essentially, what if I have a short publication list, maybe my PhD was spent building a new experiment, or I just have papers in preparation. How much is that going to hurt, and is there anything I can do to get around that?
Well, that was exactly the situation I had with one publication and a lot of good ideas. I was lucky, perhaps, to get the postdoc at the time that I did, so that I was able to pursue those ideas. Sometimes in those circumstances, the doctoral advisor would be able to come up with a short-term postdoc, 6 months or 9 months, or sometimes even a year, to let the new PhD, the fresh PhD, complete some of those publications and have a stronger case the next time around. And that's a fine thing to do. Of course, it is dependent on the availability of funding from your advisor. Some people not having that opportunity may take a job outside of the academic sector for a year, thinking that they can complete the work and publish it and then get back into the postdoc line. That's hard to do. Not many people manage to be scientifically productive while holding down a full-time job. But if your personal circumstances, maybe dual career couple circumstances, for example, allow one partner a bit of a break, then consider using that to your advantage if you're not getting the postdoc right away.
Yeah, and actually I was in a similar situation. My graduate career was building a brand new experiment, and basically I had one real serious publication, and in the end I got a postdoc with a young assistant professor who did quite well, and so I did well as a result. So, quite often, where you go is a large determining factor on things, and don't feel like you have to go with the big famous full professor. Quite often the young assistant professors are hungry and provide very good postdoc opportunities.
Right, and they get there by taking initiative. And new postdocs should also take initiative. Don't passively wait for opportunities if they're not coming to you. Try it for a while to see how proactive you can be in drumming up business, or at least in having the opportunity to publish your work and present it. That works a lot better than being passive and just hoping that, well, the collaboration finishes the paper and they speak about it for me. No, you really want to be hungry, at least show that you're hungry and that you want the position and that you are aggressively pursuing it.
Okay, I think this will be our last question. What do I do if I'm not sure whether my reference letter is going to say good things or not so good things? Any hints?
Oh, that's a tough one. It is legitimate to ask a potential referee, do you think you can write a supportive letter for me? I'm personally a bit uncomfortable coming out and asking, would you write a good letter for me? Some people are comfortable doing that, and it's okay. It's just not my style, but I would be happy to ask someone, would you write in support of me? Or would you prefer that I ask someone else? That's giving them the option. Now, if you didn't ask them and you got a letter and you suspect the letter is maybe not as supportive, there is really nothing you can do except to avoid asking that letter writer in the future. And be very, very careful about these things. Letters are meant to be confidential. You are supposed to maintain the trust of your supervisor or letter writer and he or she with you. Respect the boundaries, treat people kindly, and ideally they will reciprocate.
Okay, it looks like we're out of time for the official webinar. Thanks once again to Ed for this informative discussion. I'll now hand things back over to Crystal, who has a few announcements to share before everyone signs off.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So just a couple things I actually wanted to add. Just so you know, and I think I shared the URL earlier, but the APS online job board, which is careers.aps.org, very easy to remember. We actually have a very large, very, very large percentage of our job postings are actually postdoc positions. So, you know, I encourage you all to go and check it out and see if there's anything interesting there. You can sort it on the geographic location, the sector, all kinds of different stuff. So check it out, careers.aps.org. That's a good place to go. Also, I just want to tell everybody really quickly, there is if any of you are going to the Division of Plasma Physics meeting in Providence, we're having the DPP Job Fair, which, again, there are lots of institutions that are hiring postdocs at job fairs. So it's like October 29th through 31st in Providence. Definitely go to the DPP website or aps.org, and you can probably do a search for a DPP job fair, and it'll come right up. So a couple of little announcements there. Okay, so it looks like we're going to wrap up here, but you know, if there are some questions we did not get to today, you are welcome to follow up by sending an email to webinars@aps.org, and we can forward the questions to our speaker for comment. Slides of the presentation will be available on the main page for today's webinar, which you should be directed to at the end of the broadcast. Also, a recording of today's webinar. The whole thing has been recorded. It will appear on the webinar page as well, but we do ask that you allow 24 hours for upload. You will also receive an email from GoToWebinars that contains the link to the recorded webinar. And lastly, as you sign off today, in order to help us continue to develop quality webinar presentations, please help us by taking a moment to complete the short survey as you exit. And that wraps up today's event. We hope you'll join us again next time. Bye-bye.